HOA Karen tried to arrest my wife for parking in our driveway, not knowing she's the county sheriff. Intro. You won't believe what happened when our HOA Karen decided she had the authority to control who parks in my own driveway. She marched over, waving her clipboard like it was a badge, and tried to have my wife arrested for simply parking in front of our own home. What she didn't know, and what made her little power trip blow up in her face, is that my wife isn't just any homeowner, she's the county sheriff. And let me tell you, the look on Karen's face when the truth came out was priceless. Karen had always been the kind of neighbor who seemed to live and breathe for the HOA rulebook, or at least her version of it. She wasn't officially in charge of anything, but if you lived on our street, you'd think she was the self-appointed president, vice president, and entire board rolled into one. She walked around every day with her clipboard, scribbling notes about whose grass was a half-inch too long or which trash can wasn't tucked away fast enough after pickup. It didn't matter that some of the things she cited weren't even real rules. If Karen decided it was a problem, she treated it like a crime. I had seen her confront neighbors before, from yelling at kids for riding their bikes on the sidewalk to telling an elderly man that his porch furniture wasn't community approved. Most people either ignored her or gave in just to avoid the headache, but the tension she stirred was impossible to miss. It was like she fed off the control, standing there with that smug look that made it clear she believed she was above everyone else. Her obsession with enforcing rules had gotten so ridiculous that people would actually peek outside their blinds before doing something as simple as pulling into their own driveway, just to make sure Karen wasn't lurking nearby. I'd heard stories of her snapping pictures of people's yards and sending them out in group emails with passive-aggressive subject lines like, "We must do better." She wasn't just enforcing rules, she was inventing them as she went along, and nobody ever dared challenge her. That is, until the day she decided to take things way too far with my wife. What Karen didn't realize was that her need to control every little detail in the neighborhood was about to put her in a situation she couldn't bluff her way out of. She had crossed a line before, but this time, she was about to find out that not everyone was willing to bow down to her imaginary authority. Especially when she came after the wrong person in the wrong way at the wrong time. It was a Saturday afternoon when everything came to a boiling point. I had just finished washing the car and my wife pulled up, exhausted after a long shift. She parked right in our driveway, exactly where she belonged, and we started carrying in some groceries together. That's when I heard the familiar sound of Karen's sandals smacking against the pavement, followed by the inevitable clearing of her throat. I didn't even need to turn around to know what was coming. Karen stood there clutching her clipboard like it was some kind of weapon, her eyes narrowing at my wife's car as though it had committed a crime by existing. Without so much as a hello, she started rattling off about how the HOA supposedly had rules against non-compliant parking. According to her, my wife's vehicle was too large, too noticeable, and not in line with the aesthetic values of the neighborhood. I couldn't help but notice the absurdity of it, our driveway, our car, our property, yet she was acting as if we were violating some sacred law. My wife, calm as ever, just looked at her and asked which section of the HOA bylaws she was referring to. Karen's face twitched, and for a split second, I could see she had no real answer, but she quickly covered it up with more bluster, claiming that vehicles like ours brought down property values. She started threatening us with fines and even hinted at calling someone to handle it officially. Neighbors began to peek out of their windows and even stepped outside, sensing the drama. I could feel the eyes of the whole street on us as Karen grew more animated, waving her clipboard in my wife's face like it was a badge of authority. My wife didn't flinch, didn't raise her voice, and didn't take a single step back. Instead, she just stood there, watching Karen dig her own grave with every word. It was obvious Karen expected us to cave like so many others had before, to apologize and move our perfectly legal car just to keep the peace. But my wife wasn't about to be intimidated in her own driveway, and I could tell Karen had no idea who she was really dealing with. Karen's rant escalated faster than I thought possible. One moment she was demanding that we move the car, and the next she was pulling out her phone like she was about to call in the cavalry. She started muttering about how she had contacts who could come enforce the rules and make sure we paid for our so-called violation. Her tone shifted from bossy to downright threatening, and she loudly declared that if my wife didn't move her car immediately, she would have her arrested for trespassing. The irony of her words was almost laughable, arrested for parking in our own driveway. Neighbors who had been watching quietly started whispering, some with shocked expressions, others shaking their heads in disbelief. I could feel the tension rising in the air as Karen's voice grew sharper, practically echoing down the street. She was trying to put on a show, clearly thinking the louder she was, the more authority she had. She even started recording on her phone, as though she was documenting evidence for her imaginary case. My wife remained calm, her arms crossed, watching this unfold without so much as a flicker of fear. Karen, oblivious to just how far she was pushing things, began rattling off phrases like illegal vehicle storage and public safety hazard, none of which made any sense. Then, with a smug grin, she announced she was calling the sheriff's department right there on the spot. She tapped at her phone screen dramatically, clearly convinced this was the moment she would finally break us. She spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear, saying she was reporting an illegal vehicle blocking a driveway, our driveway, no less, as if repeating the lie would somehow make it true. The sight of her pacing with her phone pressed to her ear, nodding and smirking like she was winning a battle, was almost surreal. She was so wrapped up in her performance that she didn't notice the neighbors filming her, nor did she realize just how quickly her plan was about to backfire. My wife simply waited, letting her dig deeper into the hole she had created, knowing the truth was about to hit Karen harder than she could ever imagine. Karen was still pacing with her phone pressed to her ear, pretending to talk to someone from the sheriff's department, when my wife finally decided she had heard enough. She took a small step forward, her calm presence cutting through the chaos Karen had created, and in a voice steady enough to make everyone fall silent, she introduced herself. She didn't raise her tone, didn't show the slightest bit of anger. She just said, plain and clear, that she was the county sheriff. For a second, the entire street seemed to freeze. Karen's smirk faltered, her mouth opening slightly as if she didn't quite process what she had just heard. Some of the neighbors gasped, while others exchanged glances, waiting to see if Karen would back down. But Karen being Karen, she tried to laugh it off, saying something about how anyone could claim to be the sheriff. My wife didn't even flinch. She calmly reached into her pocket, pulled out her badge, and held it up for everyone to see. The sunlight glinted off the metal, and in that instant, the smug authority Karen had been clinging to evaporated. She blinked rapidly, her face flushing red, and the phone in her hand slowly lowered as the weight of the situation finally hit her. The same neighbors who had been watching in quiet disbelief now whispered louder, some even chuckling at the dramatic turn of events. Karen's eyes darted around as if searching for an escape, but there was none. She had been so sure she could intimidate us into submission, so certain that her word was law, and now she was standing face to face with the actual law. My wife didn't need to say much else. The badge spoke louder than any argument ever could. The silence that followed was heavy, every pair of eyes fixed on Karen, waiting to see how she would react now that her entire act had crumbled right in front of the very audience she had tried to impress. Karen's face was a picture of shock and panic. The smug confidence that had fueled her tirade just moments before drained away, replaced with a pale, nervous expression that made it clear she realized just how badly she had miscalculated. Her mouth opened and closed like she was trying to find the right words, but nothing came out at first. The neighbors, who had been watching the drama unfold with growing amusement, couldn't hold back their laughter anymore. A few chuckled under their breath, and I even heard someone whisper, "She really thought she could arrest the sheriff." Karen's hand trembled as she tried to hold on to her phone, her eyes flicking between my wife's badge and the neighbors recording the whole thing on their phones. She stammered something about just trying to keep the neighborhood safe, but her voice cracked, betraying the fear that had set in. My wife didn't raise her voice or even step closer. She just stood there with calm authority, letting Karen squirm in the silence. The power dynamic had flipped completely. Karen, who had been barking orders and acting like she controlled the entire street, was now the one cornered, trapped by her own arrogance and the truth she hadn't seen coming. The neighbors kept watching, their eyes filled with a mix of disbelief and satisfaction, clearly enjoying seeing the self-proclaimed enforcer finally brought down a notch. Karen tried to muster some dignity, straightening her shoulders and insisting it was a misunderstanding, but the redness in her cheeks and the tremble in her voice told a different story. She had wanted the entire neighborhood to see her as a hero, but instead, they were seeing her for what she truly was, a bully who had finally gone too far. The silence stretched, broken only by the occasional sound of muffled laughter, while Karen stood there frozen, unable to reclaim the authority she had lost so completely after that day. The entire neighborhood seemed different. People who had once been too nervous to stand up to Karen suddenly realized she wasn't the force of authority she had always pretended to be. The story of her trying to arrest the county sheriff spread like wildfire, retold at every backyard barbecue and whispered across fences with a mixture of disbelief and laughter. Even neighbors who usually kept to themselves started smiling a little more when they passed by, as if they were sharing an inside joke that Karen couldn't escape from. She tried at first to act like nothing had happened, walking around with her clipboard like she always had, but the confidence behind her steps was gone. People no longer rushed to move their trash cans the second she walked by, and no one bothered to answer her long-winded emails about community standards. Some even ignored her completely when she tried to confront them, walking past her as if she weren't even there. The once intimidating presence she carried had crumbled, leaving her with nothing but the memory of her humiliation. Meanwhile, my wife had unknowingly become the quiet hero of the street. Neighbors who had been too intimidated before now came up to us with smiles, thanking her for finally putting Karen in her place. A sense of relief settled over the neighborhood, like a heavy weight had finally been lifted. Children played outside more freely, families gathered in their yards without constantly looking over their shoulders, and the mood of the entire block felt lighter. Karen still lived there, of course, but she no longer had the power to make people feel small or controlled. She had been exposed, her reign of intimidation shattered in front of the very people she once lorded over, and the community was finally able to breathe again. 7.